What if I told you, somewhere out there, a fire is still burning, in a house no one lives in, a chair still rocks, on a porch no one walks by, and a bell still hums, even though its rope was cut long ago? These are not ghost stories. There's something gentler, something slower, the kind of stories that wait for you, not to be solved, but to be felt. You won't find heroes here, but you might find a woman who sleeps beneath a bell tower, a fisherman who still mends his net long after the sea is gone, a child who keeps jars of memory under their bed, because remembering quietly hurts less than forgetting loudly. So turn down the lights, find your favorite blanket, and come closer, because this story knows you're tired. It's not here to wake you up, it's here to let you rest. Deeper, find your quiet corner, wrap a blanket around your shoulders, and let the world hush for just a little while. Take a slow breath in, hold it. Now let it go. If this story brings you comfort, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe someone, somewhere, is breathing in time with you. Now, let me take you to a time when the bells stopped ringing. The village was small, just a bend in the path, a row of houses leaning into each other, as if whispering secrets only the wind could hear. At the heart of it, a chapel stood, old stone and wood, its bell tower rising above the trees, like a watchful old man. But lately, the bell didn't sing, not even for Sundays. It had grown quiet, not because the days were peaceful, but because no one was left to pull the rope. In one of the smaller homes, at the edge of the village, a boy sat on the floor, his legs tucked under him, a threadbare blanket around his shoulders. His name was Samuel, 9 years old. Maybe 10, he didn't keep count anymore. Across the room, by the small hearth that hadn't known fire in days, his grandmother stirred a pot, filled with warm water, a crust of bread soaking like it might remember how to be soup. She didn't speak much, just hummed, a sound like wind through trees. Steady, low, kind. Outside, the air was still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're being watched, not by people, but by time itself. Samuel looked at the door. It was shut tight, barred with a chair, not because of thieves, but because of the air. They said it came on the wind. The sickness, they said it crept through cracks, lingered on breath, lived in the hush. He didn't understand all of it, only that it had taken Papa, then Mama, then the neighbors, and that now. The bell didn't ring. That morning, Samuel had woken from a dream, where the world was green again, where the fields were full of goats and songs, where Mama laughed and the bread smelled like butter. But he woke to silence and the smell of boiled cloth. His grandmother handed him a bowl. No words, just eyes, soft, tired, but still here. He took it in both hands, drank slow, warm water, mostly, but it felt like kindness. Sometimes, kindness doesn't need taste, just warmth. There was a moment, just before dusk, when the light came in sideways, through the tiny window. It turned the dust into gold, lit the cracks in the wall. Like veins of sunlight, Samuel always watched for that moment. It was his favorite part of the day, the part that felt almost like a memory he hadn't lived yet. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, he stood at the window and listened, not for voices, not for horses, but for the sound that used to mean something. The bell, just one chime, a whisper of iron, anything. But the air was still, even the birds had grown quiet. Behind him, his grandmother wrapped herself in the bigger quilt. It still smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. She lit a single candle and set it by the bed. Its flame danced like it knew a song. Samuel crawled beside her, pulling the edge of the quilt to his chin. He listened to her breath. Slow, even like waves that had forgotten how to crash. He didn't ask for a story. There were no more fairy tales, only silence, and the weight of blankets, and the hush of rooms where once there were footsteps. But just before sleep took him, he whispered a question into the space between them. Do you think the bell will ring tomorrow? His grandmother didn't answer, but her hand reached out and found his, held it, warm, real, and that was enough. So let this story be a soft place to rest tonight. Let the bell rest, let the air be kind, and if your eyes grow heavy, let them close, the candle's still burning. Somewhere, Take a breath. Let it slow you down. You're not in a rush here. This is not a story that runs, it lingers, like candlelight on a stone wall. If you're still with me, let your shoulders drop. And if your blanket slipped off, go ahead, tuck it back around your legs. The night can wait. At the end of the same village, past the broken fence and the old bakery that now only smells of ash, there was a house, small, crooked, paint peeling like sunburned skin. Its windows were always closed, and on one of them, the one facing the chapel, someone had painted a thick red X. Not fresh, not new, but there, stained like dried blood. Inside that house lived a woman. They called her Miss Elsie, though no one had said her name aloud in weeks. Maybe months. She didn't mind. She'd spoken it to herself enough times. To keep it alive, Elsie. She'd whisper it when she washed her hands, when she folded her one good shawl, when she fed the cat that wasn't hers. Elsie, as if reminding the walls that she still existed. She was not young. Her bones had started to forget how to bend, but her fingers still remembered rhythm. And every morning, after wrapping her knees in wool, she would sit by the painted window and hum. It wasn't a song you'd know, not a lullaby, not a hymn, something simpler, like the wind when it weaves through branches, a melody that never quite ended and never quite began. Just there, soft, warm, human. No one came to her door, not since the red mark appeared. She hadn't heard the knock of a visitor in a long while. She liked it that way. Visitors meant stories, and stories always led to memories. Memories, in a time like this, could be sharp. Still, she kept the house in order. Each morning, she swept, even if only a single leaf had wandered in. She boiled water, not because she needed it, but because it filled the room with steam and reminded her of rain. She fed the cat, though it never stayed the night. It came just before dusk, out without looking up, and vanished before the candle was lit. They understood each other, two quiet creatures, who didn't ask for anything, but breath and warmth. The red mark on her window didn't bother her, not anymore. At first, it had. She had cried, quiet tears, one hand on the glass, the other on her chest, feeling it rise and fall like tides under moonlight. She remembered the man who came, wrapped in cloth. Face hidden, he dipped his brush in the thick red paint and made the mark with one single stroke, then walked away. He didn't say a word, neither did she. She never saw him again. There were no bodies in Elsie's house, no coughing fits, no fever, just her. But her neighbors had stopped counting reasons. One mark was enough. So they stopped calling, stopped waving from across the lane, stopped leaving soup in little clay bowls on the porch. The silence came gradually, like mist rolling in, until she couldn't remember the last time she heard her name from someone else's mouth. But silence, if you hold it gently, can become music. So each evening, she lit a candle, the one in the blue holder her husband made long ago, the one with a chip on its side, a smile missing a tooth. She set it on the windowsill, just behind the red mark, and she hummed. Outside, wind stirred the dead ivy on the gate. Sometimes a leaf would tap the glass, like a finger asking to come in. She never answered. She just sang. One night, long after the last bell had rung, and the air had turned cool, a shadow passed her window. Not a rat, not wind, something taller, slower. Elsie didn't move. She kept humming, soft. Even the shadow paused. Then it moved on. She smiled. She didn't need visitors. She only needed to remember her voice, that she could still make sound, still breathe, still mean something. And so if you pass a village like that, where the chapel has grown quiet and the windows wear red, look twice. You might see a flicker of candlelight behind a dusty pane. And if you listen closely, past the hush, past the ache, you just might hear a hum. Let this be your quiet place tonight. No need to knock. Just rest. If your breath is slow and the blanket is warm, then you've done enough. We'll see each other again soon. In the next quiet story, the boy beneath the elder tree. Are you sitting still? Good. Let your hands relax. Let your breath slow, just a little more. We're going somewhere quiet, but not cold. Somewhere with grass that still grows, and branches that still remember shade. They called him Eli, or at least, they used to. before the wind stopped carrying voices, before names were whispered more often than they were spoken. Eli was 12, or maybe 11. He didn't keep track. The calendar had long since stopped caring. He lived at the edge of the village, where the grass grew taller and the river could still be heard if you listened close. With him had been his mother and his baby brother, Simon. But today, it was just Eli and two bodies wrapped in old linen. He had spent the morning pulling apart the garden shed to find the rusted trowel. The blade was dull, the handle loose, but it would have to do. The elder tree stood just behind the chapel, its thick arms reaching over the fence, as if trying to cradle the empty yard. Eli remembered playing there once, when things still smelled like bread. When Simon still giggled at leaves, he chose that place because it felt like the only one that hadn't turned its back. The soil was dry, hard packed from weeks without rain. He pushed with both hands, knees in the dirt, shoulders burning. The first inch gave way with a sigh of dust, but every inch after fought back. He didn't cry, not at first, only worked. Dig, breathe, dig, he whispered, not to anyone in particular, just so the silence wouldn't swallow him whole. It's okay, almost there. You're like this spot. Mama. When the hole was finally deep enough, the sun had dipped behind the steeple. Shadows stretched long across the grass. The candle he'd left on the chapel step flickered like it was tired too. He brought the bundle first. Small, light. Simon had always been tiny. He laid him in the earth with careful hands, as if the ground might feel pain. Then came the second bundle. He grunted with effort. Not because she was heavy, but because his arms weren't ready to let go. Eli knelt, one hand on each shape beneath the shroud. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't know how, but he said their names. Simon. Mama! He said them once, twice, and once more, for the wind to carry. Then, slowly, with fingers shaking, he began to cover them, a little dirt at a time. He didn't rush, didn't look away, just the steady sound of earth returning to earth. The way people used to, the way people still should. When it was done, he sat back, hands caked in soil, shirt damp with sweat, face streaked with something between dust and tears. He looked up. The elder tree stood tall, leaves rustling with a softness that almost sounded like lullabies. He leaned back against its trunk, let his head rest, let his hands fall. Night was coming, but the fear didn't come with it. Not tonight. Tonight, there had been work and names spoken and something that almost felt like peace. He would sleep here, just for a little while, with the roots beneath him and the wind above. Tomorrow could worry for itself. So if you pass by a tree someday, an old elder, standing alone at the edge of a village, look for the earth beneath it. You might find it smoother, softer. And if the wind sounds like a child saying names, just smile and let it be. Let this story rest with you tonight, like roots wrapping softly around your tired thoughts. Close your eyes, and if a name comes to mind, say it gently. The world is quiet enough now to hear it. Let your breath soften. You're in no rush here. Not tonight. Let your shoulders drop. Let your eyelids grow heavier just a little. The wind outside can wait. The morning will come on its own. For now, we're stepping into a chapel where only dust remains faithful. They didn't call him by name anymore. Not because they forgot, but because there was no one left to speak it. So he called himself Keeper. Just that. Not priest, not elder, just Keeper. Each morning, he pushed open the chapel doors with both hands. They creaked in protest. They always did. The hinges had grown old before he did. Now, they simply aged together. The pews were empty, had been for weeks, or was it months? He no longer kept time in Sundays. He counted in candles. In dust, in the weight of silence, settling softly over wooden beams. Still, he kept the chapel ready, not because he expected visitors, but because the space deserved dignity. He swept the floors, moving around a stain he no longer named. He righted chairs that hadn't been touched. He dusted the altar, even though the cross was long gone. And each night, he lit 3 candles, one for memory, one for mercy, and one just because sometimes he spoke aloud. Not prayers exactly, more like thoughts shaped into rhythm. They always sat in the back. That crack in the ceiling wasn't there last winter. She used to hum during communion. The stone walls listened. They didn't interrupt, didn't correct, just held the sound, gently, like pewter holding warm water. He never opened the side door, not since the last time they brought someone in. Not to pray, but to lay still. That room still smelled like lavender and fear, so he left it alone. There was a boy once, he remembered, sat in the second pew, swinging his feet, always asked, "Why does the light come through that window?" Not the others. The man never had an answer. He still didn't, but he wiped that window clean every day, just in case someone else asked. One night, a storm rolled in, rain on the chapel roof, like fingers drumming on a closed book. He sat on the front steps, a blanket around his shoulders. The candle flickered beside him, casting a warm halo against the door. He watched the rain, didn't flinch when thunder called, just nodded, as if it, too, was a part of the ceremony. Sometimes he thought about leaving, but who would close the door behind him? Who would tell the candles it was okay to rest? He stayed because someone had to, not to be seen, not to be thanked, just to keep the place breathing, even if that breath was the sound of his own footsteps on cold stone. One afternoon, he found a flower, a small one, white, growing between two stones near the altar. He didn't touch it, didn't question how it came to be. He just sat beside it for a long while. Maybe someone had prayed, and the world answered softly. That night, he lit only one candle, not because he was tired, not because he forgot, but because the room felt full, like someone had already said grace. And if you ever pass that chapel, long after time has erased the paths to its door, and you see a flicker of light through the cracks, don't knock, just sit, let the silence speak first. And if you feel warmth in the air, even for a moment, that's him, still keeping. So rest now, let the candle stay lit, let the keeper keep watch. You've done enough today. Tomorrow, we'll walk again. Are you still awake? That's all right. The quiet has room for you. Let your chest rise slowly and full. No need to hold anything tonight. Even the whispers in the wall can wait. There was a boy, no older than 8. They called him Jonah, back when names were still passed like bread, freely and with warmth. He lived in a house, too big for one, too quiet for comfort. Its walls were made of soft, splintered wood. Its roof leaned just a little to the left, like it was tired from holding too many seasons. The front door no longer latched, but that didn't matter. No one came knocking anymore. Jonah kept mostly to one room. The back room, the one with the small window, and the yellow blanket, still folded at the foot of the bed. His mother's blanket, she used to wrap it around her shoulders when the mornings came too cold and the fire had gone out overnight. Now he wrapped it around himself, not just for warmth, but because it still smelled a little like her, like cloves and something soft he couldn't name. At night, the house made sounds. Old houses do. They creak, they shift, they hum as if trying to remember. But Jonah noticed one sound in particular, always from the far wall, the one beside the pantry. It came just after dark. Always the same scratch, pause, scratch again. At first, he was afraid, but fear wears thin when you're alone long enough. So, on the 5th night, he pressed his ear to the wall. The sound came again, scratch, scuffle, something like a breath. "They're just rats," he whispered. But something in him didn't quite believe it, because after the scratch came a pause. And in that pause, he thought he heard something else. A whisper, faint, not words, exactly, but rhythm, like the way his mother used to hum when folding laundry. A tune that never asked to be heard, just offered itself to the room. The next night, Jonah brought a piece of bread to the wall. He placed it gently on the floorboards. Then he sat cross-legged, waiting. He didn't wait for long. Out from the dark edge near the cabinet, a small grey rat appeared, cautious, thin. Its eyes blinked slowly. It didn't rush, didn't grab, it simply nibbled, like it had done this before. Not with him, but with someone else. Jonah smiled. Not because he loved rats, but because he wasn't alone. For 5 full minutes. That was something. Each night after, he left something small by the wall. Crumbs, a torn piece of cheese, even just a button once to see if the rat would take it. It didn't, but he imagined it might someday. The scratching became a kind of lullaby, a reminder that life still moved, even in the walls. And when the wind howled and the world outside felt too far gone, he pressed his cheek to the wood and whispered, "I remember you," not to the rat, but to whatever lived in that space, between real and not quite, between scratch and whisper. One evening, he swore he heard his name, not loud, not even spoken, just the shape of it, in the hush behind the wall. It made him blink, not in fear, but in recognition. So, if you ever sit in a quiet room and hear the faintest sound, a scratch, a whisper, a hush like memory, don't rush to silence it. It might just be something kind, asking to be remembered. Let the wall speak. Let the blanket hold you. Let the crumbs wait by the baseboard. And if your name comes floating back, in the hush, smile. You're not forgotten. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. If your hands are still, let them rest. We're not rushing anywhere tonight, only to a quiet room, in a house no longer watched. Her name was Anna, or maybe she went by something else before. But in this town, where doors stayed closed and windows blinked dark, she didn't need a name, just quiet, just time. She lived alone, on the second floor of a house that used to belong to a family of 5. She never asked what happened to them. The furniture was still there, chairs tucked in, blankets folded, cups washed, but never put away. She didn't move much, only enough to survive, only enough to breathe. Each morning, she washed her face with cold water from a clay bowl. Then she sat by the window, watching wind pass through curtains, like old friends waving from far away. One day, while sweeping dust from the chapel steps, Anna found a box, small, wooden, tied with string. No note, no name. She looked around. Nothing moved. Even the air held its breath. Inside, a mask, long-nosed, white, the kind worn by plague doctors. In drawing, she barely remembered. It was lighter than she expected. It smelled faintly of wax and rosemary. She didn't scream, didn't drop it. She carried it inside, with both hands, like it might break or whisper. She cleaned it, not because it was dirty, but because it felt right. A cloth, warm water, gentle circles, like tracing memories off porcelain. She didn't wear it, didn't even lift it to her face. She just placed it on the small table, by the hearth. Then she lit a candle beside it. That night, and every night after, she did the same. Wipe the mask, place it gently, light one candle, sit quietly, and watch the flame dance. In the mask's glass eyes, she didn't speak to it, but she thought things you were meant to protect. You saw too much. You weren't the villain they made you out to be. Sometimes, she imagined the mask remembering too, not in words, but in flickers of scent and sound. The clack of boots, the weight of silence in sick rooms, the shaking hands that once tied it behind someone's head. One morning, she found a feather, black, curved, lying just outside the door. She tucked it under the mask's beak, not because it belonged, but because it made the mask look like it had come back from somewhere. The candle never burned out. She replaced it each day, different heights, different wax, but always only one, always next to the mask. When the wind howled and rooftops moaned with old weight, Anna sat close to the hearth, blanket over her shoulders, eyes on the table, and it felt almost like company, not comfort, not fear, just presence. Something still that stayed. So if you ever find yourself in an abandoned house and in the quiet, you see a long-beaked mask sitting beside a single flame, don't touch it. Don't turn away. Just sit for a while. Let the room hold your breath. And know someone remembered even what was meant to be forgotten. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the mask stay where it is. Let the candle burn slow. You don't have to understand everything. Just rest and breathe. There are stories that stay behind. To keep watch with you, the boy with the onion bag. Pull your blanket a little closer. It's okay. Let your hands warm up under the fabric. Let your thoughts settle like soft dust. We're going to meet someone tonight, Someone small, but brave in a quiet kind of way. They didn't know his name. No one left to ask. No one left to tell. But if you saw him, you'd remember one thing. The small cloth bag tied around his neck with twine inside. Onions, not fancy ones, not sweet, just hard, dry bulbs the size of small fists. Sometimes white, sometimes yellow, once even purple. They rattled softly when he walked, like stones in a pocket or bones. He wore it every day, even to sleep, even when he washed in the rain barrel, with water so cold it made his teeth ache. He lived in what used to be a tailor's shop. The sign still hung outside, faded letters swaying with the breeze. The windows were cracked, but the roof held. That was enough. The first onion had been left by someone passing through, left on the doorstep, wrapped in a piece of newspaper next to a crust of bread and a broken pencil. He had picked it up, turned it over in his hand, sniffed it. Then, for reasons he couldn't name, he tied it in cloth and wore it like a necklace. He didn't do it because it worked. He did it because it felt like doing something. And sometimes, doing something is the only way not to disappear. He walked the village each morning, same path, same pace, past the closed bakery, past the chapel, past the well that hadn't held water in days, and the bag bounced gently against his chest. Rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The old woman by the red-marked house once opened her door, just a crack, and said, "You'll stink of onion forever, boy." He had just nodded, didn't say a word, just kept walking. He didn't believe the onions would save him. Not really, but they reminded him of kitchens, of stew pots bubbling, of warm hands slicing, crying not from sorrow, but from steam. Some nights, he opened the bag and placed one onion on the windowsill, just to let it breathe. He whispered to it sometimes, words no one else would hear. "You're doing good. One more day. Don't rot yet." When one started to soften, he buried it in the garden behind the shop. A quiet little funeral, a thumbprint in the dirt, a goodbye without candles. Then he'd tie a new one in its place, fresh, firm, alive. He didn't pray anymore, but he counted onions. That was close enough. And if you ever passed that street and saw a boy with a sack bouncing softly on his chest, eyes sharp, feet bare, know this? He wasn't just surviving. He was remembering, he was believing, in his own quiet way, that life could still taste like something. Let this story linger with you, like the smell of onion on old hands. Let it remind you, you don't need magic, just something you believe in, enough to carry close to your heart, even if it's just a little cloth bag with something ordinary inside, bread for the rat. Let the world hush around you now. The windows can stay closed. The clock doesn't need winding. You're safe here, still, held. If your breath has slowed, you're right where you should be. Let's step into a kitchen, dusty, yes, but kind. Her name was Mabel. She didn't say it out loud much anymore, but sometimes, when she folded laundry or tied her apron, she whispered it under her breath. Mabel, still here, still someone. The kitchen hadn't changed, even if the world had. Same old sink, same stove with the squeaky door, same window with its lace curtain, faded like paper left in sun. Only difference was the silence, no voices calling for tea, no spoon-tapping bowl, no laugh from the porch. Only her, the clock that had stopped ticking, and the rat. It wasn't a surprise when she first saw it. Small, grey, shy as a secret, it skittered across the baseboard. One evening, as she tore a piece of bread for supper, she didn't scream, didn't chase. She just looked, and the next night, she left a piece of crust by the wall. Not much, just a corner, dry, hard. She didn't leave it to feed. She left it to see. The rat came, not while she watched, but it came. The crust was gone in the morning. So, she left another, this time softer. It became habit. She didn't name it, didn't expect thanks, but the act of breaking bread for something breathing, even small, even silent, made her own hands feel less lonely. She'd whisper sometimes, not to the rat, but to the room. This one's fresher. I hope you like crust. It's just us now. She started placing the bread on a little saucer No reason. Just felt right. She cleaned it after each night, wiped it with a corner of her apron, set it back with care. One evening, she heard it. Not the scurry, not the nibble, but the pause, the moment before the eating began. Like a breath shared between guest and host, she smiled. Some days, when her knees hurt and the cold clung to her sleeves, she'd think, at least something comes home, at least something still wants what I make. She never tried to touch it, never trapped, never tested its loyalty. She just gave, because giving, even without reply, is a kind of conversation. When the bread ran low, she rationed carefully. One slice for herself, one for the rat, and the rest, just memory. So if you ever walk by a quiet kitchen and see a chipped plate by the corner wall, don't move it. It's not for you. It's for the ones who stay, even when no one calls them friend. Let this story be your soft place tonight, like the flicker of oven light in the hush before sleep, like the sound of crumbs shared in trust. You don't need much, just a little warmth, and someone, even a shadow, to share it with. Smoke in the west quarter. Wrap your blanket around tighter tonight. There's wind coming, not cold, but full of things leaving. If your eyes are still open, that's all right. You don't have to look far, just far enough to see smoke rising over rooftops. You used to call home. They called it the west quarter. Not fancy, not poor, just lived in. Houses leaned into each other, as if listening for gossip. Children used to chase chalk lines down cracked alleys. The baker knew everyone's name. That was before. Now, it was mostly empty. Shadows stayed longer than people. Wind carried silence like it carried dust. And smoke. One morning, just before light, split the sky. Thomas stood at the end of the lane. He hadn't lived there in weeks, but it had been his street, his shop, his life. And now, it burned. Not fast, not roaring, just slow, as if the houses themselves had decided they were done holding memories. He didn't move, didn't shout, didn't run for buckets. There were no more buckets, no more hands to carry them, just him. A coat too thin for wind, and eyes that didn't blink. The fire had started in the weaver's place. The old curtains, probably, or maybe the stove, or maybe it had just begun. Things have a way of ending. When no one's looking, he watched as the flames reached the corner of the roof he helped patch once. He remembered the nail that split his thumb, the way Clara laughed and brought him tea. Before the bandage, Clara had gone first. Months ago, now the roof sagged, then fell. The sound wasn't loud, just final. He didn't cry. Tears felt too loud for a moment like this. Instead, he took off his hat, held it to his chest, a gesture no one taught him. It just felt true. The wind shifted, pushing smoke east. Toward him, it smelled like pine and bread and old sweaters and endings. He whispered, to no one, to everyone, thank you. Then he turned around, walked the path away, one step, another, and never looked back. That night, he slept beneath the trees by the creek where he'd fished as a boy. No fire, no blanket, but sleep came like ash settling. So if you ever smell smoke in the distance, and it smells like things you once loved, don't run. Stand, watch, say goodbye, and let it go softly. Tonight, let that smoke be a pillow. Let your breath carry whatever you're ready to leave behind. It's all right to let some homes burn. The ones that matter. Never leave your bones. The woman who slept in the bell tower. The stairs creaked, stone, but still they creaked, as if even something that solid could learn to groan with age. She climbed them each night, always just as the sun sank below the ridge, turning the sky a kind of dusty rose, the kind of color that made you feel both full and forgotten. Her name had been Isabel. She hadn't said it aloud in weeks, maybe longer, but sometimes, when her foot caught the familiar crack on the 6th stair, she'd whisper it, soft, Isabel, just to feel like the walls still knew her. The chapel tower had once held a bell that called the whole valley to worship. Now it held only her, and the bell, silent, still hanging, like an old lung that forgot how to breathe. The space was narrow, damp. The wind slid through the slits in the stone. wrapping cold fingers around her ribs, but she stayed. Every night, curled beneath an old green coat, frayed at the hem, buttons mismatched. She'd found it in the vestry, hung behind a door like someone meant to return for it. No one ever did. She made her bed on the wooden boards, just below the bell. Sometimes, she'd sweep the dust with a handful of twigs, tied into a brush. Other times, she let it lie. Dust, after all, was mostly what the world had become. Each evening, before curling beneath the coat, she'd run her fingers along the base of the bell. It was cold, always. But once, she swore it pulsed beneath her hand. Just once. She never told anyone. There was no one to tell. She had a candle, just one, tucked in a cracked porcelain saucer. She didn't light it every night, only when the wind howled too loud, or when her breath felt shallow with memory. When she did, the light flickered high, casting long shadows of the bell's curve. Against the stone, in that golden hush, the bell looked alive again. There was a rhythm to her days. At dawn, she descended, feet bare, hands grazing the wall for balance. She'd gather water from the barrel that caught rain by the chapel's side, drink slowly, wash her face, brush her teeth with ash and mint leaf, then sit on the chapel step, watching the mist rise from the field. Where wheat used to grow, she didn't expect anyone to return, but she still wiped the pews once a week, still re-wrapped the hymnals in cloth so the damp wouldn't take them, still left the door ajar when the air smelled warm, just in case. But night belonged to the tower and to her. There was something about the height, the way the wind found its voice. Only up there, long, soft vowels, of a language forgotten by men, but remembered by stone. And sometimes, when she was half asleep, cheek pressed to the floorboards, she heard it. The bell. Not ringing, not even swaying, but breathing. It was a low sound, like a hum beneath the world, like iron remembering how to sing. She never told it to stop, never asked it to speak clearer, just listened, with her whole body, with the silence that grew between her bones. Once, she found a feather tucked in a crack of stone, white, clean, placed too precisely to have been dropped. She kept it, laid it beneath the bell, like an offering. She didn't ask who left it. She only whispered, "Thank you." And if you walk past that chapel one day, and the wind shifts sharp, and you hear something, not quite a chime, not quite a cry, look up. She's still there, eyes half closed, hand on metal, wrapped in night, still listening, still staying. Let this be your quiet place tonight. Not warm, not easy, but steady, like stone, like bells, like a woman who keeps choosing to climb. Because silence, sometimes, deserves company. The fisherman's porch. Can you hear the wind? Not rushing, not howling, just brushing soft across an old porch. That's where we're going tonight. Let your shoulders fall. Let your thoughts sit down beside your feet. There's a man we're about to meet, and he's been waiting. His name was Emery, or so it was painted, in faded blue, on the wooden crate by his door. Captain Emery, shrimp, cod, kind eyes. Nobody bought fish there anymore, not for years, but the sign stayed. Because some names deserve to stay, he lived in a crooked house, just off the bend of the river. The porch faced west, toward what used to be a dock, what used to be a current. Now the river only moved when the wind pushed it, and the dock had collapsed, like tired knees under too many goodbyes. Each morning, Emery rose just before the sun, not because of chores, but because that's what mornings were for. He filled the kettle, set it on the old stove, waited for the hiss, then the whisper, then the boil. And while the tea steeped, he'd step out onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight. They always had. They always would. He sat on the same chair, a rocker patched 3 times, paint peeling like onion skin, and across his knees, he'd lay his net, old, worn, smelling of salt and time. He didn't fix it to fish. He fixed it because his hands remembered how, and memory, when kept in the fingers, stays softer than when left only in the mind. With slow, careful loops, he mended holes, twisted knots, spliced rope, with a patience not learned, but earned. Sometimes he hummed, not songs, just patterns of sound that filled the space between needle and knot. His boat still sat in the yard, tilted, half covered in ivy, oars tucked inside, like arms folded across a chest. He never tried to lift it, never tried to drag it back to water, but he oiled the wood once a week, talked to it while he worked. Still with me, old girl. We made a good team. The boat never answered. Didn't have to. At noon, he'd take his tea in a chipped mug, sit in the shade, watch the river do nothing, and smile. Because doing nothing was sometimes the bravest thing. The neighbors had stopped asking why he kept fixing nets. There weren't any neighbors left, just the occasional squirrel, a bird with one foot, and the breeze that always knew how to arrive without knocking. Once, a girl walked by, young, carrying a pack too big for her back. She asked, "Are you waiting for fish?" He smiled, not with his mouth, but with the soft settling of his shoulders, and said, "No, girl, I'm just remembering what it felt like to wait." She left him a stone before she walked on, smooth, round, the kind you skip over still water. He kept it on the porch rail, next to the net needle, next to a seashell he didn't remember collecting. And if you ever walk by that house and see a man hunched in a chair, working old net with older hands, don't call out, just listen to the hush of rope, the creak of wood, the way memory smells like morning tea and damp pine. Let this porch be your place to land tonight. You don't have to cast out, not now. Let the net stay in your lap. Let the river stay still. Not all fishing is for fish. Some is just to remember you still know how to hold the line. The little red door. Pull the blanket a little closer. Tuck your fingers beneath it. Let the hush of the world fold over you, like the corner of a quiet street. We're going somewhere small tonight, but full. Not of people, not of sound, but of waiting. There was a house at the end of the lane. White walls, cracked like dry skin. Vines grew crooked around the windows, but not over them, as if even time had agreed to look gently there. And on its side, beneath a crooked archway, there was a door, just 4 feet tall, painted red, chipped, weathered, but still red. No one had seen it open. Not in years, not in storms, not in sun. Some said it used to be a servant's door. Some said a passage to a room built underground. Others whispered that once a child lived there and never left. No one knocked anymore, except her. Her name was Elsie. Light hair, always tied in a knot, boots scuffed at the toes, hands that looked like she'd been gardening or mending something. Most days, each morning, just as the light touched the bricks, she came. She didn't knock loud, just enough. 3 soft taps, knuckle against wood. Then she'd bend, unwrap a small cloth from her pocket, and place something by the door. A slice of oat bread, a folded note, a sprig of mint. One thing, always simple, always with care. She never stayed long, just long enough to whisper a greeting. Morning, friend, or hope the sun reached you today. Then she walked on. Some days, the bread would be gone when she came back. Sometimes not. She never checked too hard, never pressed her ear to the wood, never looked for clues. She once told the man at the cobbler's, when he asked what she was doing, just being consistent in case someone needs that. Some evenings, she sat on the stone bench, across the alley from the door, didn't speak, didn't write, just watched. The way the last light hit the keyhole, the way wind curled gently by the frame. And sometimes, when the world got very quiet, she swore she heard a breath on the other side, but that wasn't the point. The point was that someone remembered, someone still showed up, even if the door never opened, even if it wasn't a door anymore, just a promise. Painted red. One winter morning, she left a pair of gloves, small, woolen, hand-stitched. She laid them side by side, fingers touching, and walked away with her hands in her pockets, not for warmth, but to feel the echo of having let go. Weeks later, a pressed leaf appeared on the doorstep, maple, turned gold, tucked inside one of the gloves. She never said a word about it, just smiled, and the next day, left a tiny cup carved from walnut shell. No one asked her to do this, no one rewarded her, but she came every morning with something in her hand and quiet in her chest. So if you ever pass a small red door, half hidden, half holding memory, and you feel the urge to place your palm against it, even for a second, do it. Not to open, just to honor the space, where care keeps showing up, even when nothing answers back. Let this story rest with you tonight. Let it settle behind your ribs. Not heavy, not bright, just soft, like a glove left by a stranger, like a door that never needed to open, to feel like home, the one who listens to wind. Let your breath stretch out, long and light, like a breeze passing through curtains, like grass swaying in half sleep. That's where we're going, to a hill and a hush, and a girl who never interrupts the wind. No one remembered her name, not because she was forgotten, but because she never reminded anyone. She lived in a small wooden house, on the edge of the woods, where trees grew low and wind had room to run. The house had no fence, just 2 rocking chairs on the porch, a tin bucket for rain, and wind chimes made from broken spoons. They rang only when the wind really wanted to be heard. She didn't speak, not even to herself. Not because she couldn't, but because quiet had become her native tongue. Each morning, before the sun climbed high, she would walk to the edge of the hill, barefoot, hair braided, hands tucked behind her back. She'd stand, chin slightly lifted, eyes closed, and she'd listen. The wind didn't come all at once. It rolled, folded, wove itself between her fingers. Sometimes it carried the smell of firewood, sometimes wet pine, sometimes nothing, just a cool presence, like an old friend arriving without knocking. She never wrote down what she heard, but you could see it in her shoulders, when the gusts grew strong, in her breath, when the wind grew still. Once, a boy passed through. He asked her, "What do you listen for?" She didn't answer, but she pointed to a crack in the earth, where a single daisy grew, bending always west. He didn't understand, but he nodded and never asked again. One autumn afternoon, the wind came early, strong, with weight. She walked to the hill, faster this time, heart unsettled. And when she closed her eyes, the wind whispered something different. It didn't smell like pine or smoke. It smelled like memory. And the wind, soft but sure, spoke a name. Her name. She opened her eyes, not wide, just enough, and whispered back, for the first time in years, just one word. To no one. To everything. Yes, from then on, the wind felt warmer, even in snow, like it recognized her, like it was no longer just moving air. But conversation, she still didn't speak to others, didn't need to. But each day, she stood on the hill and listened, and the wind always showed up. Some days gentle, some days wild, some days quiet, as breath on glass, but always there. So if you find yourself beneath an open sky, and something brushes past your ear, like a thought you forgot you had, don't speak, just listen. It might be wind, or it might be something softer, wearing wind as a voice. Let your sleep tonight be like the wind she heard, unforced, unfolding, trusted. You don't need to say anything now. Just breathe and let something gentle carry your name a while. The jar beneath the bed. Let the night be slow tonight. Let your eyes close, even just halfway. There's no rush, no loud story here. Only a room, a child, and something hidden beneath the bed. The bed was too big for the room. Its frame creaked, but it was solid, stronger than the wind that pushed against the window each night. The blanket was blue, faded, frayed at the edges, but warm enough, and under the bed, lined in a neat little row, against the wall, were jars, glass, clean, each with a lid, tightened carefully by small hands. No labels, no dust, just light. There were 9 jars when it started. The first held a button, grey, with 4 holes, from a sweater once worn by a woman who smelled like bread and always tucked the blanket in tight. The second had a crumpled leaf, golden, dry, folded like a paper boat. Found the day the child first learned how quiet the world could become. After goodbye, another jar had a tooth, a tiny one, lost too early, kept not for luck, but to remember that growing often meant letting go, even when you didn't want to. Some jars held string, some pieces of chalk, One held a stone that still smelled faintly of river. None of them magical, none of them rare, but all of them real. And real things were harder to keep than dreams. Each night, after pulling the blanket up and folding legs to chest, the child would reach down and slide one jar out, hold it to the candlelight, turn it slowly, let the glass catch the flicker, let the memory settle, and whisper, "Still here." Then back it went, lined up again, unmoved, but never untouched. When fear came, not loud, but creeping like cold through floorboards, the jar stayed silent. And that was enough. The child never cried for the things inside. Tears were too big for memories so small. Instead, the jars were touched, wiped clean, turned just so, loved in silence. One night, the candle burned too low. There wasn't enough wax to keep it lit. So the child opened a jar, not to take from it, just to feel the air that had shared space with something worth keeping. The room didn't glow, but it didn't feel empty either. Just still, and stillness, when held gently, can feel like love. If you ever find a glass jar tucked in the back of a drawer or hidden beneath a bed, don't open it too fast. Hold it. Let the light find it. Let the moment speak first. Tonight, let your breath be soft as the dust resting on quiet glass. Let your heart slow and know what we treasure doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be held. The cat that knew the way. If your breath feels thin tonight, let it stretch. If your heart feels lost, let it rest here a while. We're going into the fog now, but you won't be alone. The trail was narrow, not overgrown, just hesitant, like it hadn't been walked in some time. Twigs snapped underfoot, leaves whispered. The sky was the color of wet cotton. And then a flick of grey. A cat, small, lean, tail curled like a question mark. It didn't meow, didn't come close. It simply looked, then turned and walked. Not fast, not slow, but just fast enough to make you follow. That's how it always began. People lost, tired, half turned back toward places that no longer fit. And there, in the hush of indecision, it appeared, never from the side, always from the front, like it had always been ahead, waiting. It never touched, never brushed a leg or nuzzled a hand, but it glanced back, often just once every few steps, as if to say, "Still with me." And when the answer was yes, it kept walking. It didn't take them to homes or safety or finish lines, just to somewhere else, somewhere a little drier, a little more lit, a little more possible. One girl followed it for 3 miles before it turned off the path and vanished into the reeds. She stood there, confused, then realized the trail had widened, and ahead, a porch light, a door, warmth. She never saw the cat again. An old man once followed it through a cemetery he'd been avoiding for years. When the cat disappeared, he found himself standing before a stone he hadn't had the courage to visit. He sat, spoke, forgave. No one ever heard it purr, but some swore they felt lighter after it passed, like grief had loosened. Just a little, like their feet belonged to them again. It never stayed, never returned the same way twice, but its prints, faint as they were, always pointed forward. And if you're lucky, on a night when mist curls close, and you feel unsure of what comes next, you might see it, grey tail, bright eyes, that glance over the shoulder, still with me. Don't ask where it leads, just follow even a few steps, even just far enough to remember how to walk. Let this story walk with you as sleep comes near. Let the trail be soft, let the silence keep you company. And if you see a cat at the edge of your dream, let it go ahead, it knows the way. The blanket kept for spring, the house was quiet, always had been, even when the world outside was not. But inside, in the room with the wide window and the shelf of folded linens, there was a drawer, and in it, a blanket. It was soft, though thinned by years, pale pink, the color of cherry blossoms seen through fog. No embroidery, no initials, just stitches, tight, careful, made by hands that knew patience. Her name was Edith. She had outlived many things, husbands, sisters, winters, but the blanket remained. And every spring, on a night only, she seemed to recognize as the night. She'd unfold it, shake it out gently, lay it across the foot of the bed, and sleep. A little deeper, she never used it in winter, not even when snow piled thick against the doors, not even when her bones ached. It wasn't for that. It was for something else. Edith knew that spring didn't come from the calendar. It came from the sound of soil softening, the smell of thaw, the way the wind felt like it had dropped its armor. On that night, the first warm night, she would light a single candle, open the window an inch, and breathe. Then, with slow hands, she'd open the drawer, touch the fabric like an old friend's cheek, and smile. The blanket carried memories of a daughter's first laugh, of tea spilled during an April rain, of a letter opened with trembling hands when she was 28 and still hoping. It wasn't magic, but it was memory. And memory, when kept warm, can feel like love. Neighbors wondered why she never moved to a newer place, why she stayed in the house with creaking pipes and too many steps. But she would say, new houses don't know when spring has come. Once, a young nurse asked her, why not use it all year? It's beautiful. Edith had looked down, smoothed the fabric, and replied, because some comforts are sweeter when waited for. Now, she was older, sleep came earlier, but still, when the time felt right, she remembered blanket, candle, breeze, and the sound of the world warming back to life. So if you ever find yourself in an old room on the cusp of a season and your fingers brush something soft you forgot you tucked away, take it out, shake it gently, let it fall across your lap. Like morning, you don't need the whole world to change. Just one night where the air feels different and you remember you're still here. Let that be tonight. Let this story lay across your shoulders like a promise kept. You don't have to chase spring. Just be ready for it. When it comes, the note inside the wall. Let the hush settle in. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the walls around you. Tonight, we're peeling back old plaster and finding something soft in the bones of a house. The house was old, not falling apart, but leaning a little, like a person who had carried too many winters. Without complaint, he came to fix the hallway. Just some paint, maybe new molding. But when he removed the baseboard, his chisel caught something. That wasn't wood, paper, folded, pressed between wall and beam. Dust clung to the corners, edges curled like leaves. But the ink, still clear, just a few lines, written by hand. He read it once, then again, and sat down, right there on the floor. If you're reading this, you've opened something I meant to keep closed. But maybe that's all right. Maybe all I wanted was not to disappear completely. No name, no date, no explanation. Just that he didn't know who wrote it. Man, woman, child. But he could feel them in the curl of the letters, in the pressure of the pen. This wasn't a letter, it was a whisper, a breath left behind, in case someone, someday, needed to hear it. He didn't show anyone, didn't post it online, didn't tell the hardware store guy. He just tucked it back, gently, between two boards, wrapped it in cloth, and resealed the wall. But that night, as he lay in bed, he whispered, "You didn't disappear," and somehow, that made sleep easier. Weeks passed. He kept working, but something softened in him. He paused more often at windows, listened more closely to the creak of floorboards. And once, he wrote something of his own on a small scrap of paper, folded it, pressed it behind a beam near the stairs. Didn't sign it. If you ever stay in that house and hear something gentle shift behind the wall, don't be afraid. It's not a ghost, just a memory, stretching its legs, just a voice, checking to see if someone's listening. Let this story linger with you tonight. Let it wrap around your heart like old wallpaper, faded, but full of someone's breath. Maybe yours, maybe someone who hasn't even lived yet, where the fire kept burning. It's all right now. You've come far. Let the blanket pull high. Let your breath slow. We're stepping into the last room tonight, one with walls made of wood, quiet as old books, and a hearth still warm. The house sat at the edge of the forest, not hidden, but not on any map. No cars in the drive, no footsteps on the porch. But inside, a fire, always a fire. No one knew who lit it, or when, but for as long as folks could remember, when the nights turned cold, if you walked near enough, you could see the flicker behind the window pane. Soft, steady, alive. No smoke rose from the chimney. No logs stacked by the door, but the hearth glowed like a secret that didn't need telling. Some said it was magic, some said a promise, others thought it was a ghost routine. But no one dared enter. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. The fire wasn't wild. It didn't crack loud. It didn't dance. It hummed, low, even like breath in sleep. Children whispered stories of an old caretaker who once waited each winter for someone who never came, of how he lit the fire every dusk, just in case, and one day never stopped. Maybe that was true, maybe not, but each night, as the world wound down and lamps were dimmed and doors locked tight, the fire stayed, burning not for warmth, but for witness, for the one who might still be out there, cold, lost, needing just one sign, that something remembered them, and maybe, deep in sleep, someone dreams of a light far off in the woods and feels, somewhere in their chest, a little warmer. If you ever pass that house, don't knock, don't enter, just pause. Watch the flame, let it hold your gaze. Let it say, without words, you are not forgotten. Tonight, as you drift into your own quiet, let the fire stay lit. Not in your room, but in your remembering. You don't have to tend it. You don't have to explain it. Just know, it's there, and it's enough. Let this whole series be your soft porch, your hush of blanket, your ember in the dark. If you feel sleepy now, let your eyes close. Somewhere, a fire still burns for you. Thank you for sitting with me, for listening with soft ears and a quieter heart. Each story was just a small light, but together, maybe they made a kind of warmth. You could rest inside if any part of these tales stayed with you. A porch, a blanket, a bell that didn't ring. I'd love to know. Tell me what you carried with you, or where you listened from, maybe even what you dreamed about after. And if these quiet stories brought you peace, consider sharing them with someone who could use a softer night. Because sometimes, a voice in the dark is all we need to remember we're not alone. Until the next hush, the next fire, the next small story, sleep well. You're safe and the ember's still glowing.